My topic for this morning, and before you go off to your adventures, is on socialism and the transition to the market economy. I'm trying to condense two different, very divergent topics into one. And so I apologize for that. One is the theoretical discussions or the debate over the nature of socialism and its ability to operate efficiently and whatnot. And the other one is the actual practice of socialism and then the transition from socialism that has been taking place since the late 1980s, early 1990s. The reason why it's necessary, I think, to talk about trying to condense these things is because the episode of the battle over socialism, to a large extent, defines sort of the Austrian school. The three major intellectual disputes, right, within Austrian economics are going to be the battle over the workability of the model of socialism, the methodological and policy conclusions of Keynesianism, all right, so the excessive aggregation and all these things like that, and then the methodological dispute over scientism, which is going to be divided up into two different kind of battlegrounds, which is going to be formalism and then positivism. All right, and at the time of Mises and Hayek's career, the world moved in a direction that favored socialism, favored Keynesianism, and argued that the unity of the sciences generated formalism and positivism, and the Austrians were on the opposite side of each of those battles, which helps explain, I think, for example, like I said in my first lecture, I went through the different historical epochs, and then in Kerzner he divided it up a little slightly differently, but almost identical epochs, except Kerzner didn't talk about. He talked about an objective factor, and I defined those epochs more in terms of psychological propositions of the people that were involved. So, you know, if you think about what the 20th century is and what the problem is, okay, so again, I'm going to be a little bit normative here, all right, it's this, from an Austrian point of view, there's an unholy alliance of scientism and statism, and that the Austrians represent the opposite side of that. All right? And so that's why they're in juxtaposition with other intellectual trends at the time. So this battle over socialism is important. It's all for our own understanding. It's also important analytically because it's in sharpening our arguments against those intellectual opponents that the self-identity comes about. Okay? So I think this is an important lesson in intellectual history. A lot of people in intellectual history treat arguments as if they are disembodied from context. But that's not true. Ideas evolve in a conversation. It's a dialogue that takes place. And if you really want to understand what, say, for example, Hayek is arguing in The Use of Knowledge in Society, you can't just read The Use of Knowledge in Society. You have to understand who it is he's trying to respond to and what they believed. Because what he's trying to do is engage in an immanent criticism. Right? There's a difference between an immanent criticism and a transcendent criticism. Right? Ayn Rand wrote transcendent criticisms. Collectivism's terrible, I'm going to stand against collectivism. All right? The Austrian economists, Mises and Hayek in particular, were engaged in an immanent criticism. What are the arguments you're making? Let me step inside of that argument and then blow it up. Okay? Deirdre McCloskey, the methodologist, she loves to compare and contrast her experience at University of Chicago, where she taught for many years, of the difference between Milton Friedman and George Stigler. She said, George Stigler, you would go into a paper seminar and you present your paper. And George Stigler would say, only an idiot would write a paper like that. No one should write a paper like that. If I was to write a paper, it certainly wouldn't be that. This is the paper I would write. And Deirdre says, you could never learn anything from that. You would get beat up, made fun of, ridiculed, but you couldn't learn anything. Milton Friedman, on the other hand, what he would say is, you know, that's not a very good paper. But if I was going to write your paper, which proves X, Y, and Z, I think it would be better if you used arguments rather than arguments 5, 6, and 7. So in order to make your paper better, which I don't agree with, you would be better off if you did this. That's an immanent criticism. So intellectual ideas take place within a context of a conversation. So you can't really understand the use of knowledge in society unless you also understand what Oscar Longo was saying, what Abel Lerner was saying, what Dickinson was saying. These are who Hayek's responding to. All right, I'll come back to this theme in a minute. And that's also true of Mises. Right? Who is Mises writing about when he writes the economic calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth? Who's his conversation partner? Who's his conversation partner when he's writing Human Action? Right? Who's his conversation? That's how you're going to find out what it is that, and where these arguments come from. You can't treat these ideas as disembodied. So keep that in mind as we walk through this argument. So, the very first thing that I want you to understand is that there's nothing wrong with incentive-based arguments. One of the most powerful books written in the last 10, 15 years is Bill Easterly's The Elusive Quest for Growth. And at the end of every chapter, he says, incentives matter. Next topic. You know what? Incentives matter. One more time with feeling. All right? Every economist, worth his, whatever the phrase is, worth his grain of salt or whatever, believes that incentives matter. This is the oldest critique of collectivism. It goes all the way back to Aristotle's critique of Plato. Right? Incentives matter. It would be a mistake for you to say, there is no such thing as an incentive problem. Right? Even think about the way Professor Kerzner put it the other day. He said, it's not that we're emphasizing the incentive problem. That may be true, but there's an additional problem. He didn't say, oh, there's an incentive problem. We're going to say that doesn't take place. It's not true that people respond rationally to incentives. Right? It's an additional thing. Why is that? That's part of a conversation. And think about how it is that incentives matter became not a successful argument against socialism. Well, socialists made a very important assumption. Does anyone know what it was? Who says it? Man will change. We will have a socialist man. Now, just so we get this on the right page, how much stronger of an argument would you have if you granted that assumption, even though it's stupid? Right? It's a massively stupid assumption. Man all of a sudden is going to be transformed into a nice man. He's all kind and happy now. Right? And, all these things like that. Stupid assumption. But even if I grant you that assumption, and I can still show you that your theories don't work, haven't I just now delivered an even stronger punch? Now welcome to Ludwig von Mises. Because that's what Mises did. He didn't deny that socialist man doesn't exist. But he said, for the sake of argument, let's assume that socialist man's in charge, but yet he's still going to confront this problem. So, the original argument is, and it's not Mises, by the way, originally this is, Vilfredo Pareto and Enrico Baroni, who in the early part of the 1900s, this was their response. Their response is, well, okay, let's assume that, you have this socialist man, but you know what? Then you're going to have a problem that the task is simply too complex. As Pareto puts in his Manual of Political Economy, the market solves a stream of equations, right, which the government official would have to do by design. All right? And as he points out, right, if I have an economy of 700 people, right, and 100 goods, the number of simultaneous system of equations that would need to be solved would be beyond the ability of any computation. So the market solves it daily, but you can't do it with your computational tools. It's too complex. Well, then how did socialists respond to that? Well, let's assume a computer. Right? We'll make a supercomputer, or we're going to have, as Trotsky put it, the mind of Laplace. Right? We're going to assume that people... So what are we assuming? We're assuming individuals who are, right, selfless and have tremendous cognitive capabilities. Okay? And the Austrians are then going to sit there and say, well, wait a minute, hold on, time out. You still would have a problem. All right? And that's where you end up with the impossibility of rational calculation. It's not that it's about husbanding resources. It's not that there's too many decisions to make. It's that without the institutional basis of private property, you will not have the knowledge necessary to engage in the calculations about the use of alternative resource use. Okay? You won't know whether or not to build railroad tracks out of platinum or out of steel. All right? Let me make sure you understand this problem. Technologically, platinum is a far superior resource than steel. It's smoother, it would last longer, the trains would run, better. But what's the problem with it? How do you know that, though? Right? How do you know that? You know that because of scarcity is indicated through prices. Well, how do you know these prices? Because people do what? They engage in exchange. What do they exchange?
Money.
Property. That's ultimately what we're doing, right? Changing property. So unless you have property, so what's Mises' argument? Without private property and the means of production, there'll be no market for the means of production. Without a market for the means of production, there'll be no money prices. Without money prices reflecting the relative scarcities, you don't know what to do. By the way, note the phrase there. You don't know what to do. You don't know how to calculate. There seems to be a knowledge problem that's embedded with the calculation problem, but we'll come back to that. All right, impossibility of rational economic calculation or socialism. Here's an easy way to understand this. You need the 3 P's to generate the 3 I's. Okay, this is for your test. I'm making that up. Property prices and profit and loss provide us with incentives, information, and innovation. You don't get the 3 P's, you don't get the 3 I's. All right? And as P.J. O'Rourke puts it, eat soup, eat stones for soup. All right? So everyone, you ever read P.J. O'Rourke's book, Eat the Rich? If you haven't, go get it. But it's a hilarious book. And he starts out with the example. It's not the perfect example, but he says, I don't get this. In Russia, they got people that can play simultaneously 3 games of chess. Right? And they're eating stones for soup. And then in the United States, we got like Bobos in paradise out there in Hollywood. And yet we're like experiencing all these wonderful things. How is that possible? It's not possible because of the inherent characteristics of the people. It's because of the system within which they operate. Right? That's why he's tries to explain this. So why do these arguments evolve the way that they did? This is what I just tried to go, right? So the incentive argument, you just assume better people. The informational complexity argument, you assume better computers. In each case, the laissez-faire argument is on the defensive. But that defensive then turns into the immanent criticism, where if you assume, even in a world of better people, even in a world of supercomputers, change in the contextual nature of our knowledge, right? So if any of you, how many are, you guys are all at this seminar, so presumably you've read a fair amount of Austrian economics, right? When you read Austrian economics, what's one of the things you first, hear from Mises, right? There is no such thing as fixed data, right? The data is constantly changing. Economics is about change, right? That's, it's always going on. Hayek says the economic problem of society is a consequence of change. It's a big theme in their idea, is that the idea that it's all about change and accommodating factors to change. That's what efficiency is in the Austrian, if we can even use that term. The Austrian notion of efficiency is adaptive efficiency, not allocational efficiency. All right? So it's adaptive to change. This is the epistemic critique, or the knowledge critique. And it has yet to be challenged effectively by socialists. Yet, people believe that they challenge it by challenging this or this. But they never really deal with Hayek's implicit economics or Mises's, the full implications of Mises's argument about monetary calculation. Which I should point out, as you've seen here, like in Steve's lecture, which I thought was very good on this, right? The monetary calculation point isn't limited to socialism. It's also what's underneath interventionism and the problem of the business cycle. Right? But it's also, on the flip side, why it is that markets work in Kerzner's. Right? It's precisely because you can engage in monetary calculation that the willingness to bet on ideas and bring those bets to life under capitalism doesn't lead to just wishful conjecture. All acts of entrepreneurship are wishful conjectures. Right? All acts of entrepreneurship are a wishful conjecture. But in the economic life, wishing it so doesn't make it so. You're disciplined by the market. How is it that you get disciplined by the market? Through monetary calculation. The weeding out of bad investments, the weeding in, right, of good investments. That's all from the profit and loss calculation. It's like, some of the questions were asked in the discussion group about, the bailouts or whatever, right? There's a wonderful little book by Dwight Lee and Richard Mackenzie. It's called The Bright Side of the Dismal Science. And what it emphasizes is the loss side. It's a profit and loss system. You need the loss side of the system for the system to work. Okay? So one of the factoids that I used to have in my head when I was doing transition studies all the time is that in New York City alone in 1995, there was more bankruptcies than all of Moscow from 1991 to 1995. Which system has a vibrant market economy? See? Right? New York City. People enter businesses and fail all the time. This is a very important message for us to communicate precisely at this point in time. Unemployment, W.H. Hutt, one of the great lines about his book Idle Resources. The Keynesians are, there's all these idle resources. And Hutt says sometimes idle resources should be idle. They're low, they're zero. Like Tyler Cowen just put a blog post up the other day about zero marginal product labor. What should happen to zero marginal product labor? It needs to become not zero marginal product labor, which means it has to make adjustments. If it remains zero marginal product labor, well, you know what? It's going to stay unemployed. And rightfully so. Right? Markets work through spurring innovation through profit and penalizing decisions through loss. Okay? The market itself has the greatest regulation mechanism known to mankind. It's called profit and loss, if allowed to operate. If you, believe in a stupid idea in the market, stupid defined objectively here as, not related to the demands of the consumers, you will pay the penalty. And you will suffer the losses and you will lose the money, unless someone bails you out. And then you can go on being stupid for a long time. Right? All right. So, think about Kerzner's pearl necklace example versus pearls formed in a circle. Right? So he mentioned this very briefly, but think about what he's saying. He's saying that, look, you look at, what's the task of picking up a pearl necklace and keeping it still in a circle? All right? If the string is attached to it, when you pick it up, it's a difficult task. It's a complex task. You'd have to, right? But then he said, but that's not really what the problem of economic calculation or socialism is it? Because what it is, it appears as if it's a necklace, but there's no string to attach all the little beads. So when you actually go to pick up the beads, they're falling all over the place. It's impossible for you to pick them all up as one because they're not stuck together. Why aren't they stuck together under socialism? Because there's no private property rights. Right? Private property rights provide the connection between all those beads, which means that you could right? Lift them up, even though it would be a difficult task. That's like in the market economy, peering into the future, an uncertain future about where the demand is. But yet, you do it through these guides and signals. But if there's no connection, you can't do it at all. I would go even further and point out that in Hayek's knowledge problem argument, it's not that the knowledge of the underlying taste, technology, and preferences is out there. See, remember in Kerzner's story, there's a linkage between the underlying variables of taste, technology, and preferences and the induced variables of prices and profit and loss. And the point of the market is that the induced variables are chasing after the underlying variables, and in equilibrium they would be perfectly aligned. So any move outside of equilibrium, there's a profit opportunity for the entrepreneur who recognizes how to move it closer to alignment. That's the arbitrage opportunity, okay? In Hayek's world, if you eliminate the profit opportunities that are there, the prices that are there, that knowledge doesn't exist. It's not that you can't get it. It doesn't come into being. It's Kerzner's pearl necklace that are just pearls formed in a circle. You can't pick it up. Socialism ain't difficult. It's impossible. Okay? Now, you have to understand what that means in terms of the conversation partner. Socialism did not mean Sweden. And socialism did not mean Princeton. Okay? Socialism meant the abolition of commodity production, and that through the means of abolishing commodity production, you'll get a burst of productivity which will eliminate scarcity in this world. So you'll have a world of tremendous material abundance, no private property, and abolition of commodity production. And Mises' argument is, okay, comrades, how are the chickens going to get into, the comrades' mouths? All right? They can't, because they don't have access to those things. And then, Hayek's later development is, to a large extent, trying to explore what happens when people try to do it, even though it's an impossible task to do. So think about the road to serfdom as countries, Mother Teresa, right? Not nasty bastard, Mother Teresa, trying to pick up the pearls, and they're in a circle, and she creates a mess. Right? So now Mother Teresa, the kind-hearted soul, it's all over the place. It's a hot mess. That's the road to serfdom. Okay. All right. So in the midst of this debate, there also develops, as Professor Kerzner pointed out, the public choice analysis of one way to think about, the nature of government planning is to not only analyze the economic issues, but then to ask the political issues about what goes on in government when they engage in planning. All right? And so shouldn't be surprising that after the road to serfdom, in the 1950s is when you start getting the theory of public choice developing. All right? And the theory of public choice is first and foremost a criticism of the idea that market participants and political participants, that the assumption of benevolence is at all acceptable. All right? So that was the counter-reaction. So the Austrians reacted one way. Public choice scholars reacted another way, which was basically, if you think about the assumptions of omniscience and benevolence, public choice assumes omniscience but challenges benevolence. The Austrians assume benevolence but challenge omniscience. Okay? But the public choice argument is not blind to the argument about coordination. So this is a book by Gordon Tullock, which was written in draft form in the 1950s, but not published until 1965. And Gordon Tullock in that book marches through, similar to what I did before, the various different arguments about an incentive argument. What's the incentives for bureaucracy? They maximize their budget, they do all those things like that. But then Tullock also asks, how is it that bureaucracies communicate information? So someone, I believe it was you, who had the graph of the healthcare system? All right, just hold it up real quick. All right. So this is going to be here. Hand this to me so I can show it. All right, this is produced, by the way, by one of my students. He's actually a Hillsdale. Oh, you got it too. Hillsdale graduate. So whether you went to Hillsdale, it's the second greatest college in the world. The first one is Grove City, where I went to school. But Pete Leeson's not here, so we can't get in a death match over this. But anyway, this is the new healthcare system. It's produced by the Joint Economic Committee. One of my students, who's actually my TA, is working at the Joint Economic Committee this summer, and this is what he did for you. What'd you do on summer vacation? That's what he did. And so Tulloch is asking the question in the politics of bureaucracy, one, what are the incentives that these bureaus, each of these bureaus would actually have, which would be to maximize their budget. But then he asks another question, oh man. Right? He asks the other question, which is, how do they communicate with one another? Right? How does information flow between the different nodes? All right? And he argues that there's going to be a coordination problem, okay, that takes place. Okay? And as you can see here, it's a, but that is kind of a complexity task rather than the informational task that I was, or the knowledge task I was talking about before. But public choice should not be disregarded in this debate. And you got to understand why it evolved and why it evolved at the time that it evolved. And it's important as an intellectual historian of economics to understand Adam Smith and John Baptiste say, and how many here have read Frederick Bastiat, who was the great popularizer of economics in the 19th century? He understood public choice. What is the greatest satire in the history of economics is the candlestick makers petitioning the government for protection from the sun. That's pure rent-seeking. Bastiat understood that. So why is it that by 1950, economics was practicing in the Samuelsonian revolution as if Bastiat never existed? And Buchanan and Tulloch and these guys had to resurrect those kind of older arguments. They also were in Adam Smith. This is Adam Smith. This should be, and this is from The Wealth of Nations. It becomes an extremely important passage in Hayek's understanding. This actually is in the context of the passage about the invisible hand. But read what he says here. What is species of domestic industry, which his capital can employ, and which the produce is likely to be of greatest value. Now the key passage. Every individual, it is evident, can, in his local situation, right, local knowledge, judge much better than any statesman or lawgiver can do for him. The statesman who should attempt to direct private people in what manner they ought to employ their capitals would not only load himself with a most unnecessary attention, difficult task, right? But assume an authority which could be safely trusted not only to no single person, but to no council or senate whatever, and which would nowhere be so dangerous as in the hands of a man who had folly and presumption enough to fancy himself fit to exercise it. Okay, that passage contains all of the insights that we're learning in this battle between socialism, Keynesianism, and then also the scientism battle. Right in here. All right? In Adam Smith in 1776. Here's a more sort of interesting way to think about this from an economist's point of view. And it's about robustness of the system. So systems have to be robust against deviations from ideal. You build in redundancy, all kinds of things like that. So when David Hume, in his essay on the independence of the parliament, wrote, in designing a government, we should begin with the presumption that all men are knaves. And therefore build a government in which knaves can't behave knavishly. All right? Smith's argument is that knavish side of us comes in the form of two types. Right? A hubristic knavery right? That's arrogance, or what Hayek calls the fatal conceit. And what's the other kind of knavery? Opportunism, right? And that's more along the lines of the public choice critique. So our knavish nature can come out in the form of our hubristic ambitions or in form of our opportunistic ambitions, right? So what's good government supposed to do? Constrain those ambitions. So think about the founding fathers. When they sat down to write the Constitution, right, what does Madison argue? What's his argument? He says, if men were angels, there'd be no need for government. If government was to be run by angels, there'd be no need for constraints. But precisely because men must rule over other men, we have to first empower and then constrain. That's the paradox of government. All right? That's the paradox of a constitutionally limited government. How do you get that to work? Well, so what I want to sort of get you to think about here is on this axis we have some notion of economic goodness. Peace, prosperity, autonomy, right? And on this axis we have behavioral assumptions. Note what's going on here. If God was in charge, right? If God was in charge, meaning a being who is omniscient, benevolent, and all-powerful. All right? So we can't like sneak something in here like, you know, they don't have all the power or whatever. If God was in charge, there would be no difference in systems. Okay? That's where you would max whatever, you know, given the realities of the world that you live in, you would all have economic goodness at the same level. Okay? But the question is, from that point of view, well, how does the system deal with deviations? And the argument that Mises and Hayek are putting forth is that liberalism, the system of private property rights, is going to be very robust against deviations from omniscience and benevolence, so that even when we're down in here where people are as they are, sometimes, you know, not very good, sometimes not very smart, you're still going to get a high level of economic goodness. But under socialism, when you have slight deviations, right, this, I couldn't draw this the way I wanted to. If I normally draw this, I'm not very good with computers, okay? So this is my problem. So normally when I draw this, what I do is this collapses very fast. Okay? And this, you know, is very robust. A robust estimator. So for those of you who are like understand what I'm talking about, David Levy, who so I can tell you a little story about scholarship. David Levy was a professor of mine, but he's actually one of the most difficult people to understand, you know, what he's saying. So when I was teaching up at NYU, I wrote a paper on Mises that got published in the sort of big book that was published on methodology. I was invited to write the piece on Mises. And I chose to write it from the point of view of Willard Quine stuff. And I talked about, you know, Quine and Mises and the nature of the arguments and analytic philosophy and how there might be parallels and whatnot. And Tyler Cowen read it when it came out, and he writes to me and he says, hey, he goes, that's a great article, but it's just like what Levy used to argue. So I'm like, really? Levy used to argue that? I don't remember that in a lecture. So I contacted David, because he's very sensitive, as a lot of scholars are, to these kind of questions. And I apologized. I said, David, I really apologize. I'm sure I must have heard it in a lecture, and it just was in the back of my head, and I never did it or anything. He goes, and he laughed in his characteristic way, and he goes, don't worry about it. It's you know, I got the idea from Mario. And he goes, as long as you cite Mario, you're okay. Mario was in the office right next to me, and I was like, no, I didn't cite him either. And so I felt very bad. It's the same thing with the robustness stuff. I've been talking about this robustness stuff since my dissertation. And I thought I was the only one ever talking about these things. If you read my dissertation, it's called The Political Economy of Soviet Socialism. And I start talking about this whole thing about robustness even back then. And then Levy started working on robustness. But Levy does it from econometrics. And what he talks about is robust estimators. And so you have an estimator that looks like this, which is an ideal estimator. All right? And then you have robust estimators, which are like that. Okay? And what Levy argues is that robust statistics, like, for example, what kind of statistical analysis. So think about the current crisis. I was just watching a YouTube video this morning on quants. Has anyone seen this YouTube video on the quants? Anyway, you should watch it. And, you know, but what they did was basically what they used was very refined models which were not robust against deviations from their assumptions. So they were doing ideal predictors. As Wolman says in the video, if housing prices had never fallen, we all would be still making a boatload of money, right? But what we didn't have is a downside risk, or what Nassim Taleb refers to as taking into account the fat tails, right? So a black swan event or something. So what Levy argues is that what you should have is robust statistics, okay? But nobody's saying there. In order to use robustness, you trade off, right, from the ideal. What I'm doing here, which is what I developed in my own way, was that in the socialist calculation debate, this wasn't what they were talking about. Mises and Hayek weren't saying that under an ideal system, right, that socialism, for example, would outperform capitalism. The starting point was that socialism and capitalism, under the ideal conditions of general competitive equilibrium, produce identical results. And then what happens is, what are the claims against deviations from those assumptions? And so I have socialism collapsing and liberalism sustaining over a longer period of time. And I think that's the way to understand what Mises and Hayek are arguing. So again, let me just make sure to clear about this, because there's some confusion sometimes within the Austrian literature about various different positions. One of the reasons for this is a kind of a simple explanation, which I just want to say, even though I don't believe it's true, but sometimes people will say things like, well, Hayek didn't emphasize private property. He actually doesn't use the word private property all that much. He chooses instead to use the word several property or separated property. But it's the same thing, right? It means, you know, you own that black shirt, right? Or I could say, you know, that black shirt is yours. I don't say that black shirt is your private property. I just say, well, that black shirt is yours and that blue shirt is yours. We have several property here. That's still private property, right? So, but let me get that. So Hayek never denies private property. Private property is at the core of his argument. We'll come back to this in a second. But so private property, as I said before, property prices and profit and loss gives you what? Incentives, information, and innovation. Innovation through the ability to engage in calculation, okay? And so what you got to see here is that, like an arrow, property is the basis for giving us prices. Prices are the knowledge necessary to engage in the calculations. Okay? So this is the sort of Austrian triangle of economic understanding. Property provides the basis. You can't get anywhere without property. Because without property, you can't get prices. Without prices, you can't calculate. All right? So you have to see these things as interrelated. So here's the brilliance of Hayek. Okay? The main point about which there can be little doubt is that Smith's chief concern was not so much with what men might occasionally achieve when he was at his best, but that he should have as little opportunity to do harm when he is at his worst. It would scarcely be too much to claim that the main merit of the individualism to which he and his contemporaries advocate is that it is a system under which bad men can do least harm. It is a social system which does not depend for its functioning on our finding good men for running it, or on men becoming better than they are now, but which makes use of men in all their given variety and complexity, sometimes good, sometimes bad, sometimes intelligent, and more often stupid. So, what does Hayek say was the great discovery of the classical liberal economists, Smith and Hume? Right? It was that under a system of private property and free competition, we will marshal the ordinary motivations of man to generate publicly desirable outcomes. That's Hayek's interpretation of the invisible hand. And it's at the core of what it means to do economics. All right? And the way you understand how the invisible hand, the mechanism of the invisible hand, all right, is you're going to take a behavioral assumption, put it inside of an institutional filter, and then generate its equilibrium properties. So now, can anyone tell me where they've read that before in a contemporary philosophy book, by the way? Come on, Peter, this is a softball for you, buddy. This is Robert Nozick's discussion of what invisible hand explanations are that form the core of anarchy, state, and utopia. He has 14 examples, right? And what are those examples? Number one of them is the economic calculation under a socialist commonwealth. All right, what's another one? The Austrian theory of the business cycle. All right, this is Robert Nozick in writing An Anarchy, State, and Utopia, singling out what is the intellectual agenda for understanding invisible hand explanations. All right, and he relies on the understanding of Mises and Hayek in this regard. Okay. Now, I'm going to get to the application of these ideas in a second, but I want you to consider again, just very briefly, the fate of F.A. Hayek. This is I was the F.A. Hayek lecturer at the LSE. This is my lecture. Is all on this fate because Hayek, taught at the LSE. And I got to give a lecture. It was one of the thrills of my life at the Old Theater, which is where Hayek gave his lectures in 1931 on prices and production. And I got to give my lecture at the same place. I gave it in front of 400 people or whatever. It was fascinating. It was really one of the things. And what I chose to do was try to explain the fate of Hayek during the period that he was at the London School of Economics till he left to go to the University of Chicago. And it's a very interesting fate because, again, as I said to you the other night, in 1931, when Hayek first came and gave those lectures, he was a rock star. Right? He was like, people were like, oh my God, this guy is a genius. Everyone became a Hayekian. People were swarming, So, it's like, just imagine, like, he was cool. Right? He was it. And then, by the end of the decade, everyone's like, Hayek, Schmayek. And not only that, it was his students who did that. So just to give you some thing here, Abba Lerner wrote his dissertation with who? F.A. Hayek. And what was his dissertation called? The Economics of Control. And what's that book about? The victory of market socialism and Keynesianism. And Hayek was his dissertation advisor. So, to put it in modern parlance, and you'll have to edit this out, Hayek, in my opinion, is sitting there with one WTF. What? Right? What happened? How do these guys get screwed up? And that explains why Hayek moves into weird things like philosophy of science and political and legal philosophy. It's precisely because he's searching for an answer of how it is that these bright and brilliant students that he's working with can get it so wrong when he's so right. And he's like, what happened? Right? So on one hand, he goes on a march of analytical economics. That leads to the pure theory of capital and other things like that, right? But on the other hand, what else is he doing? He starts an abuse of reason project. In the middle of being a technical economist, who does that? Right? Here he is, he was at that time one of the leading economists, you could arguably argue one of the two leading economists in the world. And that's not making stuff up. John Hicks, when he writes his essay on the 20th century, he says, the critical debate of the 20th century is Hayek versus Keynes. When Shackle writes his book about the 20th century, it's called The Years of High Theory. Hayek versus Keynes. Okay? It's not like Hayek was a no-name. He was a big factor. He was an it factor in economics. Okay? And all of a sudden, he has no one believing him anymore. And he's like, well, why would they do that? And the reason why they would do that is because they must be misled by a bad philosophy, to think that some arguments, because what does philosophy determine? It determines not only what are good questions to ask, but what are acceptable answers to provide. Right? You can't do science without philosophy. That's my concession to you, Peter. You can't do science without doing philosophy, because philosophy defines what are the good questions and what are acceptable answers. And so Hayek thought he had these, and then his students are flipping them all around on him. He's like, I mean, that doesn't make sense. And the other thing is if you look at him, in 1933, he writes an essay called The Trend of Economics. And his basic argument in that essay is that if you're an economist, you're a laissez-fairist. Why would you be a laissez-fairist if you're an economist? Remember? This. Right? You would know Adam Smith. That's what it means to be an economist. And if you were an economist, you would know that the local politician, he doesn't have any judgment over the local individual. And those who think he does, they're like engaged in meddlesome preferences, which is we don't allow as economics. So in 1933, he's talking about the trend of economics. The only way in which you could get an argument against economics, this, is if you denied the teaching of economics. So how could it be that the best trained economists were now arguing for the opposite of this? That's the intellectual puzzle that confronts Hayek. And it must be that in Hayek's, remember I said an ongoing conversation? So think about this conversation in the English language debate. Mises puts forth the challenge. Lange and Lerner try to respond. Hayek provides the rejoinder. And he doesn't win in the eyes of his students. They're still doing market socialism. And what they're using is neoclassical economics. Abel Lerner said the following thing. Marxism is the economics of capitalism. All right? Socialism, right? Neoclassical economics, excuse me. Marxism is economics of capitalism. Neoclassical economics is economics of socialism. That was an argument by Lerner. To understand, by the way, just very, put this in your little note file to look up after you get out of here. But read Milton Friedman's review essay of Abel Lerner's Economics of Control. Because Milton Friedman anticipates the public choice criticisms of socialism in that review essay. He says that Lerner engages in policy as if it's in a vacuum, therefore eliminating all the administrative costs associated with doing socialism, and that's what means he does bad economics. But Hayek tries to take a different tack, which is Lerner's economics is bad. So why is it that Lerner, because Lerner, and if you read The Use of Knowledge in Society, he says, when we are at a period of time where a great theorist such as Joseph Schumpeter could be misled, and the reason why Schumpeter was misled, Hayek puts the argument on, is because Schumpeter was doing an equilibrium-based theory of market socialism, in which, in equilibrium, the value of the consumer goods is perfectly imputed back to the value of the producer goods needed to produce them, which would be true in general competitive equilibrium. And Hayek's whole point, and Mises's point, is that you can't get that valuation without the market process. And in the system of simultaneous equations of Walras, okay, there is no process. It's a mathematical, so you get, as Hayek says, you get, once you have consumer values, you can impute back the producer values without an intervening process because it's simultaneous determination in the model. And Hayek's argument is you can't make that ipso facto claim. So right there and then you have all the beginnings of the germs of the idea of the development of a mature theory of the market process. How is it that you're going to impute the values back? Well, you need an intervening market for capital goods. Right? You need property, prices, and profit and loss. There is no such thing as simultaneous determination of the prices in an economy. Prices emerge out of the competitive market process. So when he writes his competitive solution paper, it's like, look, you have to discover the cost curves afresh every day. The market has to adjust to that. It's not that you can sit there and assume the costs are given. All right, and and this leads to all this particular emphasis in the Hayekian agenda. They don't get it. All these people don't get it, and so as a result, Hayek starts saying, "Well, why wouldn't you get it?" And keep in mind that he tries several bites of the apple to make sure that he's not misstating his position. It's not like he just says it once and says, "Okay," and he refuses to accept the proposition that other people are evil or stupid, right, or they agree with him. So he's constantly looking in the mirror and thinking to himself, "What the hell? What's going wrong?" Right? And so as a result, what he does is he says, it must be that they got the wrong philosophy of science. So I'm going to engage in abuse of reason project. Right? And this culminates in the counter-revolution of science, essays in the 40s, and then even in his political philosophy work, you can see the outgrowth of the abuse of reason project as being the Constitution of Liberty, in which he adopts the Humean dictum. I'm going to use reason to whittle down the claims of reason. And you can even get to the end of his life when his last book is called The Fatal Conceit. It's an abuse of reason, right? That's the hubristic bias, right? I'm going to have hubris. All right, so he also says, man, these guys aren't paying attention to institutions. They think that, remember, like in the dovetail, that if you're in general competitive equilibrium, there's no institutional differences between socialism and capitalism. But all the really interesting action is in the institutional differences. So we need to worry about property law, right? We need to understand the role of contract. We need to understand the role of politics in terms of rent-seeking or privileges. This is why, for example, if any of you read Hayek, he makes a distinction between law and legislation. He even goes as far as to try to go to what's the science of study the origins of words? Etymology, right? He goes in and he says, look, privileges, its root is in legis, right? Which means what? That, special to one, as opposed to the law, which is about generality. All right? So he's against legislation, but for, right, the law, right? And so he's going to go into the political and legal nexus. So the big move from Hayek in the 50s through the 60s is to move away from technical economics to find the root cause of why the debate screwed up in philosophy of science is in this. In a large sense, Mises is left to pick up the task of developing the economic response. And he starts to develop his theory of the market process. The market is not a place or a thing, right? It's a process. And more emphasis from human action onward is about this idea of the market as a process. By the way, you can read it in his original 1920s paper too. He says socialism has no problems of statics. It only is a problem of dynamics. That's the same thing as saying in statics the two systems are ideal. Dynamics, how do you deal with it? Socialism has no way to deal with dynamics. Mises has some wonderful lines, even though he didn't, he wasn't a native English speaker, but he has like absolutely wonderful passages. Things like the bewildering throng of economic possibilities. He's trying to emphasize to you how difficult it is for monetary calculation to work even under capitalism, precisely because if I can show you how difficult it is for people to peer through the future, that the future is unknowable but not unimaginable, and somehow the system of property prices and profit and loss guide us through this, then if you take those moorings away, how difficult do you think? Difficult to the point of impossible, right? Because you're not even going to have that data. You're not going to be able to work with it. So the implications of the debate, so Kerzner's development of the entrepreneurial theory of the market process coming on the heels of Mises. And then finally, I would argue the implications of the debate for social philosophy and policy. And this is more towards the philosophers here, but this is why I mentioned Boettke before. All right? Because, what is the core claim against classical liberalism from the left? Right? Originally, it was not that classical liberalism didn't generate prosperity. Read the Communist Manifesto. Marx admits that the bourgeoisie brought onto the world greater wealth than we ever could have imagined. All right? It's not that autonomy. Individuals had more rights under liberal systems than they ever had previously. Okay? All right? It's not that we didn't get peace. All right? Compared to the past, peace was dominated. No two capitalist economies ever fought in war against one another. Right? Free trade. What does Bastiat say? If goods and soldiers don't cross borders, soldiers certainly will. All right? So, you know, that was a standard idea. So what was the big missing thing in the late 19th century? Justice. Claims about distributive justice. All right? And so then the argument has to be, okay, well, how are we going to engage in these claims, right? In distributive justice. Can we treat the fair division as if the economy is like a candy bar that I'm dividing between my two kids, Matthew and Stephen? They go out on Halloween. They get the big Snicker bar. That's what they want. All right? So if I left it to Matthew, who was older than Stephen, right? And I'd say, Matthew, you know, why don't you split that candy bar with your brother? He would like give Stephen like this much and like take the rest, right? So what I might say instead is, hey, Matt, you cut, Stephen, you choose. And at that point, Matthew will have like, even though he's 5 years old, and the little one's 3 years old, right? He'll have a measuring rod out there to do it exactly right, because he knows even a 3-year-old ain't going to take a sliver like this. All right? So that's questions of fair division. People write books about that. But that's not how an economy operates. So Nozick devotes the whole second chapter of Anarchy, State, and Utopia, second part of the book, in Anarchy, State, and Utopia, to addressing these issues about justice. And Israel Kirzner has a whole book on capitalism, distributive justice. It's called, you know, Discovery, Capitalism, and Distributive Justice. Okay. So there's huge implications for the debate. David Schmitz, right now, is developing, he's probably the best classical liberal philosopher in the world right now. In my opinion, it's a toss-up between Schmitz and Lauren Lamaski. And Lauren is the most entertaining to be around, but that's a whole other story. But I would say those two guys are sort of at the top of the list of serious philosophers from a classical liberal point of view. And not that there's a whole bunch of other people who are really good. They would just be the ones And Schmitz is developing a whole bunch of theories right now in justice issues. He has a book called The Elements of Justice, in which he tries to engage in all these debates. And one of the things that Schmitz is really pushing forward is the idea of, you know, not abstract philosophy, but concrete is the way I would put it, right? That like the philosophy of everyday life, right? It's like the people. It's not abstractions from humanity and then figuring out right rules. It's like the rules that people would live by in the real world that could get them by. And so I think Schmitz is making some really important contributions in this. John Rawls, just one last thing on this. In the Theory of Justice, has another history of argument going on in the footnotes in that book. Again, beyond this, go and look this up. Get the book out and go and look. And what you will find, even though he rejects utilitarianism and all these other things like that, in the subcontext of the footnotes, his argument works to get the difference principle, right? Because he believes that it won't have any impact on productivity. And where does he get that argument? Because he sides with Lange and Lerner in the socialist calculation debate. If he doesn't side with Lange and Lerner, the system collapses. Therefore, it's not workable. So you get the first principle of justice, but not the second principle. Okay? That's my hypothesis to you to go and test. Okay? So, this was my teacher, Don Lavoie, unfortunately passed away coming on to almost a decade now from pancreatic cancer at the age of 50. He had a lot of things left in him to write, and it's a real tragedy, but it's a shame that he got ill and whatnot. But in 1985, he published 2 books, both of which I highly recommend to you. One is a technical book on the socialist calculation debate. Another book is a book called National Economic Planning, What is Left, which is a policy-oriented book. Cato published it, and hopefully I think Cato's going to have it online very soon because it's very relevant to the world that we're in today. But Don's basic point, he was a student of Israel Kirzner's, but Don's basic point was that if in the calculation debate, the two parties missed each other in the conversation because the Austrians were developing a theoretical perspective on the dynamic market. So they had a notion of competition as rivalry, whereas their opponents had competition as an end state. So again, that's language that you should also recognize that Nozick uses in the debate over justice, right? The issue between process-oriented ethics, all right, and end-state ethics, right? Okay, so this is what Lavoie is sort of developing. But the subcontext of this is that there's also an implication of this debate is that socialism in practice is not what people think it is. Because if it's true that socialism is technically impossible, right, what was going on in those socialist countries? Right? Socialism, the complete abolition of private property and the means of production, and the abolition of commodity production, right? And complete and comprehensive central planning, that wasn't what was going on. Something else was going on, and you have to open yourself up to that. So, one of the things that happened was the best work on Sovietology happened after Stalin died, but before they have the what's called the 1956. There's called the thaw generation. So Stalin dies. They open up the country. Scholars go over for about a period of 5 years, and then they shut it down. But during that period of time, there's a whole generation of works which actually try to do ethnography of Soviet actual life, and the development of the idea of the myth of the central plan. There's one of the great books by an economist named Joseph Berliner who taught at University of Wisconsin. And he says Blatt is higher than Stalin, which was a quote that was used by state officials, planning officials. Blatt, which means corruption, bribery, is higher than Stalin. So what you have to understand is the Soviet system was not a centrally planned system. It's something different. The macroeconomics is then we're going to sort of, emphasis on economic growth statistics. So what happens is that in the economic growth statistics, we get Keynesian analysis of made-up Keynesian data, right? Which is we're going to infer what it is that their growth rates are. So we're going to try to redo their growth rates. Now, one of the things that's important about GDP accounting is to read Simon Kuznets, who was the founder of this methodology, his criticisms of that methodology. Not the Soviet, but even in the United States. So one of the things that Kuznets points out is GDP, you don't want to have double counting, right? So what GDP did was it relied on the idea that we were in a competitive equilibrium, because price has to equal the marginal cost. Everyone knows that about prices. A characteristic of a price in an equilibrium is that condition has to hold, right? So now, think philosophically for a minute what actually that means. Right? It means that the full opportunity cost of your decision is taken into account. Full opportunity cost of your decision is taken into account. Right? Now, when I add those things up, I have a coherent whole. One piece of truck, two pieces of truck, three pieces of truck, like this, right? And I'm able to add it up. I'm able to aggregate. And then I get something meaningful. But if the price is not reflecting the full equilibrium value, when I add it up, I'm adding apples and oranges. So Kuznets argued that what we have to do, even in a capitalist economy, is understand how it is that you would try to jigger things, right? So that when you're adding up less than full equilibrium prices, right, you would somehow be able to get some meaningful aggregate out of it. That's why GDP accounting becomes a very difficult thing. Okay? Well, what about a world where there is no market prices? It's all administered prices. They have it's not even like a market economy that's groping, right? It's ministered prices that are being added up. So how the hell are the Soviet officials going to then refigure them so that you have any meaningful notion of gross domestic product? Let alone the CIA trying to refigure its figures. Okay? Here's another way to get very technical about aggregate economics. Okay? This is technical. It's a formal proof I just gave you. One weighs 300 pounds. The other one weighs 300 pounds. Okay? Sad sack McGee. Right? Happy, healthy. Okay? They both weigh 300 pounds. The aggregate figure is not telling you anything. Okay? Because what matters is the structural composition. All right? The Soviet Union was sad sack McGee. Okay? And we were looking at it and we say, oh, look at the great growth. Look at the great growth that took place. I'm not making this up. In a JPE article in the 1960s, an economist wrote the following thing. Mises used to say this. He'd say to students, don't worry. Every statement that you might make, some famous economist had said something stupid, more stupid than that. All right? In the JPE, a very sophisticated statistical analysis on Soviet collectivization concluded the following. The collectivization, while having great losses to the human and livestock population, nevertheless led to a tremendous increase in per capita GDP. Let's think about that for a second. The policy method to increase per capita GDP is cut the denominator. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? Okay? Right? Maybe it's too subtle. Okay. So, we really have to look at the cost of collectivization, not in terms of aggregation that doesn't give us structural composition, and we have to look at the cost of collectivization not in terms of cutting per capita GDP to raise, cutting the denominator to raise GDP, per capita GDP, but actually what were the consequences in the Soviet Union? What were the adaptions? What was going on? We need to get access to the system, but we weren't allowed. Okay? So one of the things that happens, and this is one of the great, Murray Rothbard in Man, Economy, and State. Again, footnote, go after you are here and go pick up Man, Economy, and State and look up the analysis of both public ownership and socialism in Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State. And one of the great claims that Rothbard makes in that book, right, is that we overestimate the amount of socialism in Russia and we underestimate the amount of socialism in the United States. That's written in 1962, written in the 50s. But the key issue here is that the Soviet-type system was one of the property rights. What do I mean by this? Property rights can be divided up into two types of bundles. Control rights and cash flow rights. And what you had in the Soviet Union was control rights, but not explicit cash flow rights. So, again, what do we know about the Soviet Union, or all social economies, was that they were shortage economies. Okay? That meant that their prices are below the market clearing level, so the quantity demanded, right, is going to exceed the quantity supplied. It's a shortage economy. All right? Now, what does this mean? Well, this isn't where the market stops, right? How many here have ever, been at a concert where the tickets sold out, and then you went to a scalper? Okay, we got one honest person, two maybe here. But forget a concert, go to a sporting event. All right, how many of you waited online to get to a concert? So what was the real price of the ticket that you just bought? Right, the monetary value plus how long you waited in line to get the ticket, right? We got to go up to the demand curve. Okay, and then we come on over. This is the real price of the good. This is the official price. Okay? So what does that represent? These are non-monetary costs to the buyer without simultaneously being monetary benefits to the seller. Is everyone with me? There are non-monetary costs to the buyer that are not simultaneously monetary benefits to the seller. In a normal market, right, the exchanges are, right, that a monetary cost to the seller is a monetary benefit to the buyer, a monetary cost to the buyer is a monetary benefit to the seller. That's how they work the exchange. So now, remember what I said, they have control rights but not cash flow rights. What we economists call a rent, right? They want to get access to the rent. So, use an example away from the Soviet Union, New York City under rent control. Rent control means what? The price is below the market. That's why there's a shortage on apartments. So what do you have to pay? Kerzner actually gave you an example of this the other day. Right? What do you have to do? Usually you have to buy a key fee. You have the rent control apartment, but then you have to buy the key to get into the apartment. And the key is what? The rent. Tries to capture that thing. Right? So if you have control rights, but not cash flow rights, you're still going to try to transform these non-monetary costs into monetary benefits for self. This, by the way, is the experience that all post-Soviet type people experienced in markets in the Soviet Union. This is their black market experience. This is what they think markets are like. Okay? So, what goes on in the transition from socialism, right? We have a collapse. There's a myth of the central plan. So we have ownership rights and rents. We have to engage in a from here to now. You can't just start with an imaginary start state. You have to begin with the recognition that someone owns these rents and this flow of those rents. And they have to be somehow defeated. And so in a lot of my work, and I'm just now going to spin through this real quick because when I ask some questions or whatever, but a lot of this work is about rent seeking in the transitional gains trap, establishing a credible commitment by the government so that they won't interfere in the market economy in the future, and what you have to do with signaling and commitment ideas. So to put this in a more blunt sort of way, this is the basic program. So communism collapses, and the first thing we have to recognize is that transition problems are not economic problems, but they're political and legal problems. Economic problems are not economic problems because the economics will solve itself. If you establish a credible commitment that you're not going to interfere with discretionary policies, agents within the economy are going to transact and realize the gains from trade. So to the extent that they are economic issues, they're really simple economic issues. Simply get out of the way and let individuals realize gains from trade. Let me put this in a very concrete example for you guys here. First-class mail, fax machines, email. First-class mail, U.S. Postal Service, right? Governed by a postal monopoly. Employer, right? U.S. employer, postal monopoly.